start our recording here. Today we have the pleasure of doing a webinar with Derek Lostetter, and on behalf of fire mitigation and fire safety and fire education. And I'll let Derek introduce himself the rest of the way, but just appreciate everyone jumping on today for our little webinar. And again, it will be recorded, and you'll be able to find this in both the Microsoft Teams for emergency management and the OEE SharePoint for under the PRU section under emergency management resources. So if you can't find it in either one of those places, or you don't know how to, just contact me. I will make sure my email is in the chat, but you probably all have it since you joined the webinar, and then you guys can get it that way as well. So with that, Derek, I'll hand it over to you, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks everybody for joining this morning. Apologies, my connectivity is bad, so I'm going to have to leave my camera off, but I'll be sharing my screen most of the time, and so I'll just go ahead and bring up that presentation now. Again, my name is Derek Lostetter. I'm the Agriculture and Food System Specialist for the Mountain Region, but my background is in more or less equal parts forestry and agriculture. So
Derek, we lost your audio, if you can hear us.
I appreciate opportunities that I have. So today, can you
It came back for a second, now we've lost you again.
hear me? Hello?
Now we can hear you.
Hello? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay, I apologize. I'm trying to I turn that off. Trying to disconnect anything else that might be connected to my network. I don't know if it's a local outage or what, but apologies for that. And if you lose me, like Beth, you just did, please let me know, and then I can just repeat myself. But yeah, going to be talking about fire management, fire mitigation. And I like to kind of start discussions like this by coming back to telling the right story when we're talking about fire management. And I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Ethiopia, and one of the projects that I had the opportunity to work on was fuel efficient stoves. So for reducing deforestation and reducing costs for people who use wood as a fuel source. And I was selected by Peace Corps to present to then EPA Administrator Lisa Jackson. And I got into my spiel about how important these stoves were for people, and then Administrator Jackson reached over and grabbed my hand, and this is in front of a whole international media crew, and said, "You're telling the wrong story." The correct story is that this is about saving people's lives. One of the beneficial side effects is that we're reducing deforestation, we're improving the cost effectiveness of these stoves and things like that. But really, we're saving people's lives by improving air quality and creating a safer environment for people. So that is the right story that we need to tell when we're talking about fire mitigation and fire-wise planning. And just to put that kind of in some context, globally in 2023, wildfires emitted nearly 3 times the emissions of the entire European Union from fossil fuel consumption. So wildfires play a significant role in climate change. So not only are they driven by climate change, they can drive climate change as well. And in the US, since 2000, fires have become 4 times as large and 3 times as frequent. So they're becoming larger, they're becoming more intense, more severe. And this is only going to get worse, unfortunately. There's a 14-fold increase predicted by the end of this century, so the last quarter of this century. And it's only going to be an exponential rise to that point. It's only going to get worse. So we need to start planning, and this is especially important in the Western United States. So you can kind of see from this diagram, the biggest impacts are expected west of Colorado's eastern border. So this is something that we need to be paying more attention to, and acknowledging that this is going to be impacting more people in the West, and particularly in Colorado, the people that we work with. And we don't have to go far back in our state's history to see the most expensive, the most costly fire, which was the Marshall Fire in, almost 4 years ago. And it was over $2 billion in losses. And it was estimated that over two-thirds of the people that lost their homes in that fire didn't have adequate insurance to cover their losses. So it wasn't just, oh, okay, we get our insurance payout and we can rebuild. There's a lot of money coming out of pocket for this and damage to infrastructure that would allow effective reconstruction. So this is about saving lives. This is about saving property. This is about saving economic development for the state. Um, and most significantly, when you think about the arid West and fires, you kind of have to think about water. And the Marshall Fire itself damaged multiple public water systems. And this was through contamination of water from infrastructure damage from like water lines, power infrastructure, power loss, sedimentation of these reservoirs and water intake, uh, inlets and things like that. And then also, there's clean water, but there's also the clean air component that we need to keep in mind when we're telling the right story. So wildfire smoke causes 4,000 to 9,000 premature deaths annually. That might not seem like a lot to a lot of people over the whole country, but that's still premature deaths that would not have happened otherwise. And it costs 36 to 82 billion dollars annually because of this wildfire smoke. And that's due to multiple reasons. Could be from healthcare costs, could be tourism, agriculture, multiple parts of the economy that are impacted by wildfire smoke. And really, this came about because of our management or mismanagement of the forest over the last 100 years, which just means that we need to be more and more proactive when we're managing our forest going forward. So, for example, here's a mature mixed conifer forest in the western U.S. And then it's adapted to having relatively frequent low severity fires with occasional fires that do have torching. So individual tree canopies that are burned. It's not a rolling canopy fire where you have, the fire spreading from canopy to canopy to canopy. It can climb individual trees and it can kill those. But the structure and the diversity in the forest remains relatively intact. There's not, large changes. Old trees die, new trees grow in, and so when you're left after 80 years, it looks largely the same because you have that again that frequent ground fire coming through every few years, and then about every 20, 40 years, you get a larger fire event that can change the succession of the forest species. But instead, this is what we've been left with. This overstocked, very shaded, contiguous canopy in the forest that can spread fire very well, and it promotes high severity fires that can sterilize the soil, and they move very quickly, and they send embers for miles ahead of them. So they're very hard to control once they do start burning, which makes it even more important for us to create these kind of pockets of managed space within these high severity risk forests. And we have the home ignition zone, or the defensible space around a home, or really any structure. It could be a residence or it could be a business. and it's broken into zones of management. So coming out from the property, we have zone 1, which is roughly 0 to 5 feet, zone 2, 5 to 30 feet, and then zone 3, 30 to 100 feet. If you can manage beyond that, great. If not, this is kind of a minimum recommended allowance. And you might see, different publications promoting different distances, but really this is given as a minimum. You can go more management than this, but don't go less than this. And here's the side view, kind of a profile view of that same model. We need to look at the structural ignitability of the man-made structures themselves, but also the defensible space that we're creating around them. And then the closer that we get to the target, again, could be residence, business, or infrastructure, like a electrical substation or something like that, it increases the amount of management that's needed. And we can work our way from the outside in, and this is kind of the way that I like to frame it. So zone 3, we have managed wild. Zone 2, we have a transitional zone in between that managed wild. And then zone 1, we have the fire hardened structure itself. So zone 3, we have managed wilds. This zone focuses on mitigation that keeps fire on the ground and making choices that improve forest health. So the commonality in between all of these zones is that we want to keep fire on the ground. Fire isn't inherently bad, but when it gets a chance to rise, then severity can increase and it can spread much faster. So you want to work with adjoining property owners if your property line is less than 100 feet away. Again, that's kind of the minimum. You want to ensure adequate access and signage for emergency workers and vehicles. So this means maintaining good roads, good signage, so that people know if there is an emergency, they can access your property quickly. Mowing grasses isn't necessary in this zone, but it's especially important to watch for hazards from ladder fuels, so like shrubs or small trees that might be able to carry the fire from the ground up into the canopy. And then you want to consider creating openings or meadows between small clumps of trees. So this is, again, easier to maintain the fire on the ground, maintain visibility, but this is also healthier for the forest ecosystem. This is kind of what it's been adapted to be, these, openings or meadows. And then you also want to treat slash. So any slash that's produced from the thinning efforts you want to treat in some way. So you can either completely remove it, you can, as part of a community chipping program or, a local biomass sorting facility like composting or things like that. You can pile and burn it using proper permits. You can lop and scatter, which means that you just kind of break it down into smaller pieces and it's really coarse mulching. And this, the fuel is still in the forest, but it's keeping that fire close to the ground to prevent it from climbing into the canopy. And then, of course, you can chip it if you have your own, own chipper, or if you can rent one, work with a neighbor to rent one and do it that way. And then in zone 3, it's kind of some more traditional forest management. And that can be based on trees per acre and also basal area of a tree. And I'm not going to go into this in depth. I have some slides that I'm going to really clip through quickly. But I wanted to just introduce this to you. So if you wanted to talk more about it, if you are interested in some resources regarding traditional forest management using trees per acre and basal area, I can provide those. But basal area of the tree is the cross-sectional area of the tree. So if you were to cut it at breast height, what would be that area of the circle that's created in the tree? And then you can combine that and have a cumulative basal area of the forest. And so again, there's some basic math involved that I don't want you to focus on too much, but I want you to know that it is a tool that's available and it's very easy to use. You can use a penny gauge, you can use an angle gauge, a prism that counts in and out trees to develop a basal area estimate. So again, I'm just trying to introduce this to you. I'm not really expecting you to, remember these slides with how quickly I'm going through them. But one thing that's important to keep in mind is that historically, many forests in Colorado contained as few as 10 to 30 mature trees per acre. So significantly fewer trees than we have right now. And roughly a third of the landscape was large meadows. So it had more of a park-like, savanna, almost like a golf course feel in a lot of these forests, which we have some pushback on forest management because people say like, oh, they're cutting down all of the trees, and it can be really jarring, but it's a matter of shifting baselines. People see these overly dense forests, and that's what they think a forest should look like. But really, the ideal forest cover is much less than that. And then the target basal area is different for each species or combination of species. Like for example, ponderosa pine, definitely more of that park-like species, generally have a basal area of around 20 to 80 square feet per acre, whereas lodgepole pine stands should be kept below around 120. So there's not, a set rule of thumb across all forest types, but there are rules of thumb within the forest types. And so that brings us into the transitional zone away from that managed wild zone. This zone is designed to give an approaching fire less fuel, reducing its intensity as it gets nearer to structures. So in this zone, you do want to mow grasses, ideally 2 to 5 inches. You don't want to mow it lower than that because it can stress it, and you don't want to leave it higher than that because again, you have issues with flame length and the amount of fuel available to a ground fire. You want to remove surface fuels like small logs and branches. If you have, whole trees on the ground or standing snags, they really don't contribute much to fire risk and fire severity, so you can leave those on the landscape. They can be important, nurse logs for other trees or perennials, and they can add some character to the landscape. So you don't necessarily need to remove the, large logs that might be on the ground. You want to remove enough trees to create at least 10 feet of space between crowns. So from one branch of a tree to another branch of an adjacent tree, you want to have at least 10 feet of space. Again, to prevent that fire, if it does get into one of those tree crowns, it doesn't spread throughout the forest canopy. Small groups of trees can be left, but groups should be spaced at least 30 feet apart. So one thing that I liked about forestry when I was learning about it as a career is that there's something called the clumpy gappy mentality. So you want to have a clumpy gappy forest, which is a term that is actually used in forestry literature, which I think is fun. So you can have groups of trees, but they should be spaced further apart because there is going to be more concentrated fuel within that cluster of trees. You want to remove ladder fuels, so again, fuels that might be able to spread the fire from the ground up higher into the canopy. You want to prune tree branches to a height of 8 feet from the ground, or a third of the total height of the tree, whichever is less. So you don't want to create these lollipop trees, which might be more prone to damage, and it can stress the tree considerably if you try to remove that much at one time. And then you want to remove stressed, diseased, dead, or dying trees and shrubs that could add to the fuel load. And in this zone, it's important to pay attention to vertical spacing. So you want to maintain space between the lowest tree branches and the ground or shrubs. So and I'll have some images of this, but you want to remove all tree branches at least 6 feet from the ground. And then allow extra vertical space between shrubs and trees. The lack of vertical space can allow a fire to move from the ground, from the brush to tree canopies like ladder. So, hence the term ladder fuels. This leads to more intense fire closer to your home. So again, this zone is about reducing fire intensity as it gets closer to the target, whatever it might be. keep at least 3 times the height of any shrubs between the shrubs and the lowest branches of the tree because fire rises. And so you don't want to be lighting trees above the shrubs on fire. So just as a simple example, a 5-foot shrub is growing near a tree, could be a juniper, and then 15 feet of clearance is needed between the top of the shrub and the canopy base height, that lowest tree branch. So here's just an image, 6-foot minimum clearance for a tree that's clear underneath it. And then you want to maintain 3 times the height of a shrub or other ladder fuels in between that lowest branch and the shrub or ladder fuel. And then you want to pay attention to horizontal spacing as well, especially on slopes. So the amount of horizontal space depends on the slope of the land and the height of shrub or trees. So you want to leave more space in between fuel sources on steeper slopes because, again, fire goes more quickly uphill than downhill. Heat rises, embers float upwards, things like that. So space between shrubs, flat or mild slope, 2 times shrub height, moderate slope, 4 times shrub height, moderate to steep, 6 times the shrub height in between the shrubs themselves. And then between trees, you want to maintain less than, you want to have at least 10 feet again. But then that's kind of the baseline. 10 feet is the baseline. But if you get to more moderate or severe slopes, that can go up to 20, 30 feet in between trees because that vertical distance is shorter. So you want to maintain the distance between those fuel sources by increasing the horizontal, sideways space between the fuel. And then a lot of people, they think, oh, okay, that's a very steep slope. But this line right here is a 45-degree angle or 100% slope. And so this is the cutoff lines for those moderate to severe slopes. So really, it doesn't take much slope to have a big impact on how you have to space these trees and shrubs to reduce your fire risk. So look at how mild that slope is, and where those changes occur. And then, kind of a side interest of mine, you've probably already heard me talk about biochar, but it's a way to reduce fuel loads as well as make beneficial use of the wood and reduce atmospheric carbon by sequestering carbon in these pure carbon recalcitrant chars that don't decompose microbially. And you can either take that biochar out of the forest, or you can leave it within the forest. It's really up to you. And you can again, you can use really simple methods, like this is a conservation burn pile on the left. And it's basically a slash pile that you build a little different and you light from the top. So it doesn't burn as intense or as quickly, but then you're left with some biochar, and it also reduces smoke emissions as well because the fire itself is driving off the volatile compounds that smoke, and the flame consumes those. So instead of being lit from the bottom, like a traditional slash pile, where all the material up top is heated and starts to volatilize and produce smoke, and then the flames down below so it doesn't get to it, these conservation burn piles burn the smoke that they produce. So the emissions, they're better for particulates as well. So for visibility and health, these can be, better choices if you're in a high impact area. It's harder to manage a lot of these piles at once. A lot of forest management on national forest land, they light hundreds of piles a day. So they can really just go from one pile to the next. They just shove a torch in, the bottom to make sure it's lit, and then they move on to the next one. So these can't be used in every case, but they are a simple and effective way to dispose of biomass on your property. But you do need proper permitting for these, and that's easily available through your local county or through the state, depending upon whether the county has more restrictive rules than the state. And then there are options for renting or hiring people to bring in equipment like this air curtain burner, that's on the bottom right. So this is loaded with wood, and then there's a motor that powers a blower to keep the smoke in the box, and then the fire again burns the smoke, and then you're left with biochar at the end of the day. And so if you might be wondering what biochar is, really it's designer biochar. The idea is to have some of this charcoal that's left after the burn, which you can distribute to improve the soil quality, the soil health, where you distribute the biochar, or again, if you want, you can take it out of the forest and use it in, a garden or agricultural uses. If you're more interested in learning about biochar, you can go to the CoBurn page. So this is curated by CSU Extension. If you just Google, CSU biochar CoBurn, that's really the easiest way to get to it because the URL is kind of lengthy. So you can find state-specific resources for biochar. The CoBurn stands for Colorado Biochar Use Resource Network. So if you want to learn about biochar more, you can check that out. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat with you about it. I'll probably talk with you more than you would like me to talk about it. So just be forewarned if you're interested in biochar. And then we get into the structure of that you're wanting to protect. And in some literature, this is called zone 0. The actual structure itself is called zone 0. And then the immediate area around the structure, again, that, like 0 to 5 feet is zone 1. You want to ensure the roof material has a Class A fire rating. People might think, oh, you need to have like metal or slate or something like that to be Class A, but there are shingles that are Class A fire rating. So you have a lot of opportunities there. You want to remove all leaves and other debris from decks, roofs, and gutters. So anything that could really catch an ember and be lit on fire. You want to screen attic, roof, eaves, and foundation vents with metal mesh. You don't want to use wood lath or anything like that. You want to use 1/8 of an inch metal mesh because that's better at excluding embers, and it obviously won't catch on fire because it's metal. You want to screen or wall in stilt foundations and decks with mesh. So, this is very common in Colorado. People have, a nice deck overlooking, a steep drop off on their property, something like that. And then you have these big exposed stilts that the deck is built on. But that's not ideal, again, because the flame can move right up under that deck, especially if you've stacked firewood or, you're using that area under the deck for storage. That can cause significant issues. So you want to screen that off to reduce the chance of embers or the flame front moving underneath and catching those poles or whatever you might be storing under there. Use tempered glass for windows, at least double pane. So most new homes in Colorado are built with double pane glass, but for older homes, this can be an issue. And this has to do with the transference of heat into the home. So just like you have double pane glass to improve the insulation, from the heat or cold outside, it can do that for fire as well. If you have those extreme heat events outside, it can prevent, curtains from catching on fire and things like that from the radiant heat, which can happen. You want to create at least 6 inches of vertical clearance between the ground and siding, especially if you have flammable siding. So if you have wood or vinyl siding, um, this is important. But it's less important if you have stucco or or just straight concrete siding, steel siding, things like that. Especially if you've paid attention to managing your zone 2 and zone 1 by reducing the fuel loads and keeping that fire on the ground. Um, if you have those alternate non-flammable siding options, that's ideal. And then increasingly, insurance companies are requiring them uh, to be covered. So people might have to replace their siding, or they might be kind of mandated by their insurance to have more than 6 inches. And then, like I brought up with the zone 3, you want to post signs at the end of the driveway with your house number that are non-combustible, reflective, and easily visible to emergency responders. So you want them to stand out as much as possible. So this is not just important for Amazon deliveries. This is also important for emergency responders to get to your property quickly and being able to communicate where a fire event might be taking place if they are defending your property already. And most homes lost to wildfire are ignited by flying embers. They can travel for miles ahead of the active front of wildfires. So even if you've done everything right in your zones 3 and your zones 2, if you slack in zone 0 and zone 1, you can still have an ember that floats over and lights something on fire. So you want to harden the target that you're working with. Again, could be residents, could be commercial property, could be infrastructure. And then the immediate area around there, you want to limit the chances for a fire to catch or move into the target structure. Here are just some examples. You can see multiple examples in these pictures. So the picture on the left has a shutter for that opening. You have a steel roof, and then you have an area directly around the structure that is flagstone and rock. So there's not going to be a flame that is allowed to move directly against that structure. On the right, you have someone that's putting down some rock immediately against that structure to prevent the fire from moving in. And then you have that fence and gate that are galvanized chain link fencing, so you don't have a wooden fence that's going to be able to catch on fire and spread the fire to the structure. It's difficult to see what's going on with the deck back behind the woman with the wheelbarrow, but hopefully they would be screening that, or they're taking proactive action, like they're putting this rock down right up against the structure. Here's an example of that screen to prevent embers from floating under the deck if possible. Obviously, you can still see there's some vegetation, some weeds that might be able to catch on fire under there. So it would be important to manage those, or have some type of sprinkler system, something that could help combat the flame front as it gets closer to that exposed deck. On the right, we have a fully enclosed deck. It's the house is stucco, and then that kind of knee wall around the deck is all stucco as well. And then in addition to that, you have the rocks immediately around the deck, and then you have Firewise landscaping beyond that. So that kind of moves us from the structure itself and the man-made structures and fencing and things like that, and into the landscape portion. So in zone 1, it's recommended that you use hardscape like gravel, pavers, or concrete. Even decks, there's some decking material, composite material that's flame retardant or doesn't carry a flame as well as wood. So you might want to consider that if you're having to, replace a deck or if you're building new construction. You want to remove all branches within 10 feet of the structure. So this is on all sides, including above the house. So, in Colorado, this is very common. We get houses built in the woods. That's the environment they want to be in. And then they have trees growing right up against the house, even some growing over the house. And not only is this a risk because you can have fire moving into that canopy and dropping, embers down onto the house, you have that potential for debris buildup. So as trees are dropping leaves, dropping needles, dropping pine cones, they can collect in the gutters or in valleys on your roof. And those can be an ignition point where an ember can float over and light those on fire. You want to limit combustible items like outdoor furniture on top of decks, as much as possible. Everything's a balance. So you don't want to, have to roll your, patio furniture on the deck, every time you want to use it and things like that. But if you can limit it, try not to just use your deck as storage. You want to relocate firewood and lumber to zone 2. So again, that transitional zone away from the structure. Replace combustible fencing, gates, and arbors that are attached to the home or really within 10 feet of the home with non-combustible alternatives or less combustible alternatives. You want to consider relocating garbage and recycling containers out of this zone. So really, again, like 5 to 10 feet away from the structure. Consider relocating boats, RVs, vehicles, and other combustible items outside this zone. If not possible, add buffers. If you have a camper, put it on a gravel pad. Make sure that the area around that pad is mowed, things like that. So again, it's trade-offs that you're trying to take when you're managing the space immediately around a high value structure. The goal isn't to limit materials that can direct fire to the structure, or excuse me, the goal is to limit materials that can direct fire to the structure or increase flame length. So, in a lot of cases, if this area is effectively managed and if you have had that management in zones 2 and 3, the fire is just going to be putzing along, and someone with a garden hose could take care of it. You don't need to have someone with a fire hose, to be dousing the property. So it makes it much more likely for your house to survive a fire if you have to evacuate, and if you have first responders on site that's spraying the fire, they can just protect your property. The flame front moves on and they can move on to protecting the next property. I'm just going to take a drink here. And then I mentioned previously, you want to remove or modify wicks or fuses that could lead a fire to the structure. So this could be, fencing. This could be retaining walls even, like railroad ties, things like that. And then also tree plantings. So I worked with a lot of people in North Dakota, for example, that would plant windbreaks around their property, and they'd have a nice row of junipers, leading out on their 2 or 3 acres that they had, and then it would lead right up to their patio. And so if there was a fire that would catch any of those trees, the fire would just easily move both directions along that row of trees and potentially lead right to the house itself. So it's not saying you can't use these materials, it's saying break that continuity. Just like you're wanting to space trees apart, you want to break the continuity of these materials that could carry a flame to the house. So yeah, things like fences, pergolas, arbors, wooden decks, and then again, those tree and shrub plantings. So clear away brush, dry grass, mulch, and other fuels near to fences, so you're reducing the chance of them catching in the first place. and then replacing at least the last 5 feet of the combustible fence with non-combustible section. So this is a good time to incorporate a metal gate. It can add to the aesthetics of the property. It doesn't have to detract. If you want to invest in a metal gate, um, or some pavers to kind of break up that fire. And then lastly, I wanted to get a little bit into low flammability landscape plants. So just because you're wanting to, reduce your fire risk doesn't mean that you can only plant, like cacti in rock mulch. There are options depending upon, your site, how much sun it is, how much water is available to it, things like that. And this is a good resource that Extension put out with the Colorado State Forest Service, low flammability landscape plans. It's not an exhaustive list by any means, but it's a good reference point to give people ideas on what could be planted. And then often this can kind of spur additional ideas on what could be planted. And it's nice because it's broken out by common scientific name, shade preference, water needs, height, color, elevation, adaptability, bloom time, and then the low flammability rating. So it has a lot of information packed into one publication. And then plants with a higher score means low flammability. So you want something with a high score. Plants with a lower score means high flammability. And a lot of this, rating system has to do with the fire triangle, which some of you might already be familiar with. So there has to be oxygen, heat, and fuel. So the plant characteristics impact this fire triangle. So some of the attributes that decrease flammability are low oil or resin content, high moisture content, soap, latex, or pectin content, which actually have a flame retardant effect. Compact growth form, so it's not a large, airy, bushy plant. Green stems, so they're fleshy, contain a lot of moisture, and then they're drought tolerant. So if there is a drought, then the plants can respond accordingly instead of drying out or dying. And then attributes that increase flammability generally are high oil or resin content, low moisture content, tall growth with an open form, fine or twiggy stems, and high water needs. So there's some native plants like unfortunately like mountain mahogany and things like that, which are great for native landscaping, but they're not great for having right up next to your home or business because they have a lot of these attributes. So for example, tall growth, open form, and woody or twiggy stems. So it's important to look at both the native adaptability as well as the flammability of these plants when you're planting them, and especially in that zone 0 or zone 1. And again, that this document isn't exhaustive, but it's a starting point to at least give you some ideas. And I've just taken a few of my favorites from that document as another starting point to simplify it even more. So some native low water flowers and ground covers, yarrow and penstemon. These are perennials, native perennials that can be a good ground cover. And they can spread, so hence them being ground covers. You also have native low water shrubs, trees, and cacti. So things like cholla, cacti, and sumacs can surprisingly, be relatively fire resistant, low flammability, because again, they have high moisture content in their leaves, and they're very fleshy, so they can be more difficult to burn. And then we have non-native, low water plants, things like Jupiter's beard and lupine. There are some plants in this list that, there's native and non-native varieties available. So some of that distinction is arbitrary in this document, but I'm just using these as examples. So Jupiter's beard and in this case, a non-native lupine, if you want to go for something with a different color than the native lupine. Low water trees and shrubs, there's a lot of options here. Again, if you're talking about zone one, you want to keep these away from the structure, unless, like in this picture on the right, you have these yucca that are growing right up against the concrete siding of the building. So it's going to be low flammability. So yeah, things like crabapple, yucca, lots of options for low water trees and shrubs. Don't let planting a tree scare you. You can certainly still incorporate these into the landscape. You just need to plan accordingly. We have turf grasses. So still bear in mind you want to keep these away from the foundation, especially if you have a flammable siding. But things like blue grama, state grass in Colorado, a great option and provides some perennial interest. And then low flammability plants with higher water needs. Again, depending upon the site, we have the Colorado blue columbine, and then we have hostas. Uh, you have to take deer resistance and other wildlife activities into account for these, but they can still be appropriate even into zone one, certainly within zone two. And that's all I have prepared, but I would welcome any questions. I know I went through that very quickly, so if anyone has any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to address those either here or offline.
Derek, Retta had a really good question, and I had one as well. So Retta, if you're able to mic, feel free to do so.
Okay. Derek, awesome presentation. Thank you so much. So my question was, I was talking to a forester and she said specifically, I think this was, yeah, relative to zone two, that it was unnecessary to cut pinions and junipers to 8 foot height above the ground. And she was saying that it was ineffective to how these trees ignite. And I'm cool with that. I was just surprised to hear it because that the messaging is you do need to remove those ladder fuels. So I just wanted to get your perspective on that and help me understand zone two relative to those specific tree types.
Yeah, pinyon juniper forests are tricky because both pinyon and juniper are highly flammable, and they have very bushy growth habits that are close to the ground. And they can be ladder fuels for, especially into kind of transitional forest types like pinyon juniper leading into ponderosa pine. We can definitely see that. And in that case, it's not necessary to like prune off all the branches up to 8 feet because then you're going to be left with a lollipop, and it's not going to be healthy for the tree. It's going to stress the tree, which means you're going to have more dead trees if you hack at it that much. But you want to still prune it up if possible. You can leave the main branches, um, but you can go along those branches because often they start low and then they curve upwards and outwards. And so you can prune along those branches. It takes more time, but you can prune along those branches up to about breast height. So you don't want to, yeah, really, again, hack at pinyon and juniper. Um, but saying that that's not the way that they typically ignite, I think I would kind of push back on that because absolutely they can spread through, ground fire up into that canopy. And so if you can reduce the continuity of fuels from the ground, like any potential grasses, up into those lower branches, then that's good. But I would, like especially within that zone two, where you want to keep the fire on the ground, um, prune up to at least breast height.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.
And Derek, I have a question. So last year, with one of the fires we had here in Pueblo, I was interested when you brought up like the cholla cactuses being lower on the flammability scale because
Yeah.
I don't, and maybe it's a fire question more than a plant question, but they ended up becoming like bombs in my area where they were exploding with the fire we were dealing with. And they like we had to get homeowners that were kind of like trying to protect their land was having to like mow them down and stuff because they were such an issue with that fire. So is that more of a fire behavior question, or do you know what might have caused that specifically?
Yeah, because like in this document, if you have a high severity flame front moving through, everything is going to burn and it's going to add to the fuel load. Even hostas, when they dry out and they burn, it's still going to add to your fuel load. So that's why, you know, depending upon what management tools are at your disposal, either like mowing around the cholla, creating a fuel break. So, you know, either you can till, so you can plow up and have an actual bare earth or rock fire break, or completely remove vegetation within that fire break, except for grasses that you keep pretty low or naturally relatively low, like buffalo grass, things like that. Um, but yeah, I mean, anything is flammable in the right situations. Um, and personally, I wouldn't put like a cholla cactus right up against my house still, because you have those spines on the cacti that can act as ladder fuel, depending upon if you have anything else growing around it. So it's all trade-offs. Unfortunately, there's not really a clear answer. There's just methods that you can use in your given situation.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I was just really curious because yeah, I also didn't think they would react that way, and they were popping off everywhere. So that was a learning moment in Pueblo last year.
Yeah, interesting.
Any other questions for Derek? And if your guys' mic isn't working, you're welcome to type it in the chat as well.
I have another question, but I would defer if there's somebody who has not yet asked a question.
I think you can go ahead and ask it, Retta, especially since I know you have to jump off soon.
Okay. Derek, could you talk a little more about that greater than 6 inch vertical clearance between the ground and the siding and like what resources are available for that? I don't know if I'm fully getting it. Is it like putting in, yeah, just talk more about it. I know you had a picture, but yeah, I don't
Yeah,
think I'm fully getting it.
yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for the clarifying question. So that specifically has to do with like mulch, wood mulch. And I've heard from increasing numbers of people who are replacing wood mulch with rock mulch because they're seeing, oh, this mulch burned in this fire, which is bad. Um, but again, it has to do with fire severity. If it's a smoldering fire in your mulch, if we're talking about, an active fire event that's encroaching on property, um, I'm not concerned about wood mulch. I'm concerned about wood embers, but it's still important to keep in mind that if you have wood mulch right up against your wood siding, or or if there's, only 6 inches or less in between that flammable material and your siding, um, then that's a potential ignition point. So you want to make sure there's not any vegetation or combustible material, whether it's wood mulch or rubber mulch, coming right up against your foundation where your siding is right above it. So you want to have more of a buffer. Does that make sense, Rita?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think in my head I was like, does it mean putting in 6 inches of metal siding at the bottom of the structure? So no, it does not. It just means what you just described, like the connectivity between the mulch on the ground and the siding itself. So thank you.
Right,
And correct
right.
me again if I didn't get it, but I think I got it.
No, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, some might choose to put, like a foot of flashing, um, where their exposed foundation meets their siding or something like that to kind of increase that area even more, and reduce the fire risk. Yep. Presentation went crazy.
Awesome. Thanks, Derek. Anyone else have questions or anything?
Okay, I have one more question, but I will again. Anybody else have a question who's not me?
Go for it, Retta.
Okay, sorry. Well, okay, Gamble Oak, I think, also presents a unique challenge. So I liked what you said
hmm
about clumpy, groupy with Gamble Oak, but like, I guess just talk more about Gamble Oak because it's a hard one. Like it regrows very vigorously, so you have to maintain it. Also, I guess if I picture a clump, I could see how it applies, but it's like spindly stems if it is not along the ground, so it's just kind of a different tree. And I know it's also really flammable. So obviously we don't want it in zone one. Could you talk
Right.
about it in zone management of it in zone two and three? It's also good
Yeah.
for wildlife. So
Yeah, yeah, certainly. I love gamble oak, and it's an important species for, like multiple Lepidoptera and, insects and wildlife. Um, but yeah, it does pose unique concerns for fire management. As you said, certainly wouldn't have it in zone one. Um, Zone two, certainly you could have it. Zone three, certainly you could have it. But just like those groupings of trees and shrubs, um, as you said, as you know, gamble oak grows in thickets. It doesn't grow as individual stems, and so you can have those clumps, and gamble oak grows best in those thickets. That's where it's healthiest and most productive, and provides the most benefits. But you want to make sure that there's not any continuity of fuel that could spread from, like a ponderosa pine tree that might drop needles onto it, often you get kind of these, depending upon the topography of the property, you can have these, ridges of gamble oak that kind of wind along. And so you can break that continuity into smaller clumps, keeping grass mowed, in zone two, around those clumps. Zone three, I wouldn't be as concerned about it. Um, Certainly wouldn't prune it up, for instance. And then it's up to you if you want to prune it up in zone two. I would just treat it as a clump of trees, and try to reduce that continuity both horizontally and vertically.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Greta, because we have a lot of Gamble Oak here too, and it's always an item of discussion. Anyone else have anything last? We have like 2 more minutes on the webinar here. Okay, Scott, I see yours about grassland fires. Yeah, we can definitely look at doing one about that as well. So yeah, we can definitely do more of these guys, and we have a few more that we have for the rest of the year. So they are in the Engage calendar, and then that's Derek's information there. So please save it in case you have other questions for him as far as like wildfire forest goes, and all that good stuff. And then this will be available both in our Teams area of OEE and then also in the OEE SharePoint folder. When you go to the PRU section, click on emergency management and you'll be able to get the link. And then Derek, if you're okay with it, I can also put your slides like in a PDF there as well, just so people have the information if you're okay with that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Feel free. Thank
Cool.
you.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining. We're going to go ahead and log off for today. And then our monthly meeting for the emergency management, it's going to get bumped up just an hour for next week. So just be aware of that. I will edit the calendar invite and then I will fix it on the Engage calendar deal as well. So just be aware of that. So it'll just be a little earlier, but still in the morning. And we'll talk with you all then. So thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks, Derek. And we'll chat with you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.